Our next unit is energy transformations. And as you may have heard, energy is not created or destroyed, it just changes forms. And the same thing holds true in an ecosystem and in living systems. So we're going to talk about how energy can be transformed from solar energy to food energy by plants, and how the energy from the food that we eat can be transformed into usable energy for living organisms. Before we can understand an ecosystem and how energy is transformed in it, we must first understand the basic structure of that ecosystem. One of the things that is essential for us to know is that the sun is the ultimate source of energy on Earth. The sun is what provides all of the energy that plants use and that you and I use in order to properly function. We should also understand that plants are what we call autotrophs, meaning that they can make their own food. We can also call them producers because they can produce their own food, and they do this through a process called photosynthesis. Other parts of a food web that we would want to understand are the difference between herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores. Together, we call all of these things, herbivores, omnivores, and carnivores, we call them heterotrophs. Heterotroph means that they need to eat other organisms in order to obtain their food and their energy. The prefix hetero means other or different. So hetero, eat others. And so let's just go ahead and let's label the producers, the herbivores, the omnivores, and the carnivores in this food web. Our producer is the grass. And grass does photosynthesis in order to produce its own food. Things that eat grass could be a deer. Deer are herbivore. That's all they eat is grass. Rabbits are herbivores. All they eat is grass. And insects are herbivores. All they eat is plants and grass. And so all of these things are heterotrophs. They're eating another organism. They are eating grass. They are also herbivores. Omnivores are organisms that can eat both producers and consumers. And so our only omnivore in this food web is a mouse. So we're just going to label that O for omnivore, eating both a producer, they eat grass, and a consumer, they eat insects. And carnivores are things that strictly eat other consumers. And so we have three carnivores in this specific food web. We have a shrew, a snake, and a cougar. To show how energy flows in a food web or in an ecosystem, we are going to use arrows on a diagram. And when we're drawing our arrows, we point the arrow in the direction that energy is flowing. So the sun is the ultimate source of energy, and plants use the sun's energy to do photosynthesis. So we're going to draw that arrow pointing towards the grass. The grass does photosynthesis. It takes that sun energy and produces its own food. Now there are things that eat the grass in order to obtain their own energy. Those things we called in the last slide, we called those herbivores. So we have deer, which eat our grass and obtain energy from it. We have rabbits, which eat our grass and obtain energy from it. And we have insects that eat grass and obtain their energy from it. Those are our herbivores. We also had an omnivore, the mouse, which also ate the grass to obtain energy. We can show how energy is transferred from a herbivore to a carnivore as well by doing the same thing. We can draw those arrows. So we know that mice eat insects. They're omnivores. So I'm going to draw an arrow to the mouse. We know that shrew eat insects. So I'm going to draw an arrow to the shrew. And we know that a snake will eat both a shrew and a mouse. And we know that a cougar will eat both a rabbit and a deer. Now from this we can also figure out what's the predator and what's the prey. We know that insects, mice, rabbits, and deer are all predators of grass. We know that a cougar is a predator to rabbit and a deer, and we can continue to do this throughout the rest of the food web. The one thing that we are missing in this food web is decomposers. And decomposers could be anything like bacteria. So these are my single-cell bacteria that I'm drawing here. They could be other insects. That's a terrible drawn insect, but it's an insect. Maybe worms. Worms are good decomposers. And so what the role of decomposers is to take all of the nutrients and energy that is locked up in these organisms and their living bodies, and when they die, it's to break them down into their most basic nutrients and recycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem. So in a food web, we would connect all of these things to our decomposers, because when they die, our decomposers are going to be responsible for decomposing them and breaking them down and recycling their nutrients. And all of these nutrients are going to go back into our ecosystem, and our producers will be able to use it in order to grow again. And so as you can see, this whole thing creates what you might call, if you've ever watched The Lion King, the circle of life. Everything, energy, nutrients, get recycled throughout an ecosystem as energy is transformed and passed on. If you've ever noticed in an ecosystem or a food web, though, it's limited in size. Typically, they're not all that big. And there's a specific reason for it. And it's because as our energy gets transferred from one level to the next, some energy is actually lost. And it's typically lost in the form of heat. And we know this, the Earth is heated by the sun, right? So let's say the sun contains 100% of all energy on Earth, okay? And as the sun emits energy towards Earth's surface, 90% of it gets lost as heat. Only 10% of it is used and transferred to the grass. Okay? Well, then we have our deer, our rabbit, our mouse, and our insect that also eat the grass. When they eat the grass, 90% of that 10% is lost. And so 90% again is lost as heat, and 10% is actually getting passed on. And that's true for the rabbit, for the mouse, and for the insects as well. And when the cougar goes ahead and tries to eat that deer, again, 90% is lost as heat, and 10% is getting passed on. So when you think about it, follow me in the upper left-hand corner here, the sun had 100%. 10% of that made its way to grass. So grass has 10% of that energy. When the deer ate the grass, only 10% of that went on. So now the deer has 1% of what the energy in the sun was. And when the cougar goes to eat the deer, only 0.1% of that total energy that started out with the sun makes it to the cougar. And so if we had a predator above the cougar, if something ate the cougar, it would have to eat so much that it probably wouldn't be able to successfully live. And so that's what limits our food webs in size. As we talked about before, plants are autotrophs. That means that they can make their own food. We also call them producers because they can produce their own food. And they do this through a process called photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is dependent on the sun. Plants absorb sun energy in an organelle that we call chloroplasts. And chloroplasts are what make our plants typically green. Okay, they contain this chemical inside of them called chlorophyll. It's a green pigment, and that's actually what is the sun-capturing chemical inside of a plant cell. And so if you look at a plant leaf, you see this entire structure. But if we were to zoom in on it a couple of hundred times, so imagine this is your microscope and you're zooming in 400 times here, this is what you would see. And these individual green dots inside of the cell that you're seeing are actually chloroplasts, and those are the organelles inside of a plant cell that actually go ahead and they carry out photosynthesis, the process through which sun energy is being used to convert carbon dioxide and water into food in the form of sugar. And if we zoomed in on a chloroplast 1,000 times, this is what we would see. We would see that it has an outer membrane because it is a eukaryotic organism. Eukaryote means that it has membrane-bound organelles. And we would see a fluid-filled space called the stroma. And we would see these stacks of organelles called thylakoids. So this is the basic structure of the chloroplast. This is where photosynthesis is happening. This is where sun energy is converted into food energy in the form of sugar. And so let's just start out looking at the equation for photosynthesis. Plants require a couple of things. We know this. Plants require water. So if I write the chemical equation, they require 6 water molecules. They require 6 carbon molecules, CO2, and they require sun energy. And with those things, with that sun energy, they are able to create a total of 6 glucose molecules. Glucose is a form of sugar. The chemical equation for that is C6H12O6. And they also create oxygen. That's the gas that you and I breathe, that we need to live. And so these things over here are what we call our reactants. These are the things that plants need in order to carry out photosynthesis. These are our products. These are the things that are produced during the process of photosynthesis. So plants will absorb CO2 through a pore in the bottom of their leaves called stomata, and they'll absorb water through their roots. And when sun is present, we can observe something called the light reactions occurring. And the light reactions result in the splitting of water which causes oxygen to be released. And it also results in the creation of this high energy molecule that you and I can use as our energy, as our currency to carry out our everyday functions. It's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So the light reactions, the presence of sun, causes this water molecule to be split and releasing oxygen, the gas you and I breathe, and the production of ATP, this high energy molecule. Those light reactions, that process occurs right here in the thylakoids, those stacks that you would see in a chloroplast. The second part of photosynthesis is when the chloroplast takes that ATP that was produced in the light reactions, that usable energy, and that second step is called the dark reactions. And so it takes that ATP, it takes that energy, and it takes the carbon dioxide, so it uses carbon dioxide that's absorbed, to combine it with the hydrogen from water and it creates sugar, it creates glucose, which we said was C6H12O6. And so this is creating storable energy. Sugar, as you know, if you have eaten it and never had a sugar high, sugar is stored energy, and later on we can use that energy to break it down and produce ATP, to produce usable energy to carry out functions like running, jumping, breathing, thinking, seeing, and all of those things. And so as I mentioned, We have now created in plants through photosynthesis C6H12O6. We've produced sugar, we've produced glucose, and that's stored energy. But we need to be able to break that stored energy down. And we do that through a process called cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is done by all living things. All living things need to be able to break down this sugar and transform it into that usable energy, ATP. And so we would find this in plant cells. We would also find this in animal cells. This process, cellular respiration, occurs in a cell organelle called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is often referred to as the cell's powerhouse because, again, it is what breaks down sugar and turns it into our usable energy form, ATP. There are two types of cellular respiration. The first type we're going to talk about is aerobic. And so in aerobic, you should hear the word air. So this means that O2 is present, oxygen is present. In aerobic respiration, we are able to produce the maximum amount of energy, the maximum amount of ATP. So if you think about it, if you were able to breathe versus having to hold your breath and not breathe, which one would you have the most energy after doing? And it would be while you were breathing. And that's because during aerobic respiration, we are able to take that glucose molecule, C6H12O6, and we are able to break it down to its most simple form. And we're able to break it down all the way, making 36 ATP, making 36 usable energy molecules. And so this is super, super important. And that's why when you're an athlete, we really focus on your breathing technique. When you're lifting, you have to focus on your breathing technique because you want to get the maximum amount of energy out of that sugar that you're breaking down. And so when we also break down this ATP, the other byproduct of it is, as you know, the gas that we breathe out, carbon dioxide. The other type of cellular respiration is anaerobic respiration. An means without, so this is without oxygen. There's no oxygen present. This is that example where I said, hey, you're holding your breath now. Try to produce some energy. In this process, that glucose, that C6H12O6, that does not get broken down all the way. It only goes through the first step of cellular respiration. And it gets broken down into only 2 ATP. Okay, that's not a lot of energy. And so having oxygen present is very, very important in order for eukaryotes, animals and plants to produce the maximum amount of energy from that sugar that we are storing. The other part of anaerobic respiration is this. We produce some carbon dioxide, but we also produce, and you've probably heard this before, through fermentation, we produce one of two products. Animals, we produce something called lactic acid. This is that burning sensation that you get in your muscles when you're really, really working hard. Things like bacteria and yeast, they produce alcohol. So this is how brewers of beer and wine make alcohol, is they put yeast in a bottle, they remove all of the oxygen, so no oxygen is present. Those yeast have to do anaerobic respiration. They make 2 ATP, they produce some carbon dioxide, CO2, which is the carbonation in that drink, and they do fermentation, they produce alcohol. That's how alcoholic beverages are created. So let's put it all together. The sun is the ultimate source of energy on Earth. The sun gives energy to producers, and producers can do photosynthesis. They produce glucose in the form, or which is a sugar. It's stored energy. And so without producers, we're in big trouble because you and I, deer, cougar, rabbits, they cannot do photosynthesis. This is a very essential process. When a deer eats the grass, they are taking the sugar that the grass has made through photosynthesis and they are breaking it down through cellular respiration to produce ATP, which is usable energy for themselves. If they're breathing, they're going to produce a lot of energy, 36 ATP. It's a lot of usable energy to be able to do the things deer need to do to avoid predators like the cougar. If they're not breathing, they're only going to produce 2 ATP. That's going to present a big problem. That's not a lot of energy for them. So there's a little bit of a link there. But let's explore that link a little bit more. Plants, I'm going to do, up here I'm going to do red is photosynthesis, and I'm going to do blue is cellular respiration. Plants do photosynthesis, and so they're producing oxygen, and they're producing glucose, C6H12O6. Both of these things, oxygen and glucose, are things that are needed by deer, by cougar, and all of the other animals in this food web. Plants can also do, that should be blue. Plants can also do cellular respiration, meaning that they can take the glucose, the sugar, and they can create CO2. If you remember, photosynthesis required CO2 in order for it to properly function. So when you look at it, plants can complete this entire cycle by themselves. Plants are almost completely 100% independent. They can create their own food through photosynthesis, and they can break their own food down through cellular respiration. However, plants can do photosynthesis at a higher rate when there's more CO2 available. So luckily for plants, all of these animals also do cellular respiration and produce CO2, which means that all goes back to the plant to do photosynthesis. Again, we are seeing this massive cycle in which we see a circle of life. All living things are interconnected, and it's through these energy transformations, photosynthesis and cellular respiration.